Hello, welcome to Vlog 1, Skills vs Capacities in the Weight Room, Regnum 191267. Here we have an athlete attempting to do the back squat. We can see here that the athlete is getting a lot of hip flexion and not a lot of dorsiflexion. As we can see, they drop down to get to the depth and the knees are not coming over the toes very well. So we can see we've got a hip flexion of 36 degrees, a knee flexion of 79 degrees, and a dorsiflexion of only 78 degrees here. When viewing this athlete from the front in their back squat, we can see that their shoulders are not level. They are falling forward slightly. As we can see from the first clip, that there's a lot of hip flexion to try and get the athlete to hit that depth. So from the side, we can see that there is a lack of dorsiflexion to allow knee travel over the toes. So when we do the wall touch test to assess dorsiflexion, we can see that the athlete is struggling to touch the wall with their knee and keep their heel on the ground with only 72 degrees of ankle dorsiflexion. By using these flexibility tests, we can assess to see that this is probably indicating more of a capacity issue than a skill issue, with the problem being a lack of dorsiflexion involved. So here we see our athlete doing derivatives of the squat, using a counterbalance here to see if the hip capability is there. We can see they're a little bit more upright here as they reach parallel, but there is still not much dorsiflexion going on. So we see that they've got the hip capability to squat deeper, but those knees still need to travel over the toes to allow that center of mass to sit back. But as we put our athletes through these derivatives of the squat, we can start to see the flexibility issues. As we mentioned with the calves, the capacity is there in the hips, but a counterbalance looks like it's going to benefit our athlete more to stay more upright. As we elevate those heels, more dorsiflexion is allowed, as we can see here. The knees can travel further over those toes and allows the athlete to actually sit back a little bit better, as we can see through this line through the middle of the athlete, which is a much more desired position for our back squat. So with this elevation of the heels, we're in a much favoured position. However, as we can see now, we've created ourselves a new problem of the pelvis looking to tuck underneath us. When we looked to elevate the heels and use a counterbalance weight, the athlete can sit back very nicely. You can see they're a lot more in an upright position of the torso, and the centre of mass, it looks like it's in a much better position. They're able to get a good amount of depth as well. But we can see that pelvis now is looking to tuck underneath. So this is another issue that we would now need to address now we've solved the capacity issue through the calves. So our second athlete, we can see here performing a squat from the sagittal plane. Before we begin, this athlete is 6'4", so already struggling with limb length. We can see here he initiates a squat through knee flexion, not hip flexion. We can see he has this nice upright torso and achieves a good depth. However, he's pushing onto those toes. We can see he's falling forward to achieve that depth. A study done by Fry would suggest that this is down to a flexibility issue. When we view this athlete squat from behind, we can see there is a shift onto that right side. We can see as the athlete drops into that hole and begins to get to depth, we can see the ankles begin to collapse as he gets there. Lally states this is almost down to dorsiflexion and a lack of dorsiflexion involved. We can see on the left here that there's a much bigger gap than there is on the right. We can see more of the leg, suggesting that shift onto the right hand side. For the reason for this needs to be addressed then, and we can see that it is not down to ankle dorsiflexion. He can get a good touch onto the wall with that knee. So the athlete appears to have sufficient ankle dorsiflexion, so we look to see if the hip capacity is there. And when he performs the squat with a counterbalance, we can see that he is in a nice and upright position still, and there isn't so much shifting onto those toes as he remains in a nice position with the centre of mass on the heels a bit more. We can see that they cannot keep a straight line as their foot comes into the air. And this could possibly translate over to the squat. So we can see from this hip extension exercise that the athlete adopts a similar pattern to his squat, with the ankles rolling in and the knees pushing wide. And this would maybe then be down to a motor pattern issue and therefore a skill problem in our athlete. So the next thing to do then is to assess the hip mobility in this athlete. And Peterson would suggest that the limb that is being shifted towards should have greater internal rotation than the other limb. However, when we look at this athlete, when we get to this point, we will see that this is not the case. We can see our athlete's mobility is pretty good on the internal and external rotation in the hip joint. So they seem to be pretty similar on both sides. Therefore, we can see this is down to a motor pattern issue and therefore to skill. So we can look to utilize a box to make the athlete aware of their hip position on the descent. So the next movement we're looking at is the overhead press. And here we see an athlete pressing the bar overhead. We see the bar path comes forward rather than straight up. The elbows don't appear to be under the bar, and we're seeing some extension in that lumbar spine too. So from the frontal plane, we can see the athlete pressing the bar overhead. We can see that the bar path is not level, and we can also see that there is quite a flare of the rib cage to get that bar up above the head. There doesn't appear to be any control in the glutes or the midsection of the core either. So when I get the athlete to try and create a straighter bar path, the control from the core completely goes, and we can see hyperextension of the lower back and flaring of the rib cage. The athlete then cannot keep the elbows underneath the bar to press overhead, and we get that scooping action. So if control of the spine is an issue pressing overhead, we should see if the athlete can control his spine without load. And we can see that he comes into a nice hyperextended position, and he can also flex that spine very nicely as well through the thoracic. So this doesn't appear to be an issue. So it would appear then that this is a capacity issue and the athlete has a tightness somewhere. So we're looking here to see if how his latissimus dorsi range of motion is. We're also going to assess the pectoralis major as well. So here we can see the athlete can get his arms back to a nice flexed position, but he cannot seem to duck his head under, which might suggest that there is some tightness affecting how his shoulder girdle movement occurs. So down to this capacity in our athlete, it is affecting the overhead press through a tightness of the latissimus dorsi, and as we can see from our athlete's external rotation of the shoulder girdle, he cannot fully get his hands back onto the mirror. As we can see, there's a big gap there. So the athlete would need to struggle to and increase this range of motion out. As we can see, that the spine hyperextends so that our athlete can reach that desired horizontal push. Here we can see our athlete performing our overhead press from the sagittal plane, and we can see them pressing the bar overhead, but to get there they need to use a scooping fashion, and they can't start with their elbows underneath the bar path. From the frontal plane, we can see that there is not quite level as our athlete is pressing overhead as well. So from behind, we can see that the scapula is not level, and this would explain why the bar path is not going in that straight line, and why the bar is not straight as the athlete presses it overhead. So we can see then what this problem is. So assessing our athlete's lateral abduction, we can see that they don't pull in a straight line. Their right arm comes higher, and when we look from the back, there is a massive difference in where the scapula is sitting in our athlete as they try to retract that scapula. There also appears to be a lack of control. So viewing our athlete from the sagittal plane, trying to achieve external rotation in the shoulder, which results in a lack of control. So when we view this athlete from the front, we can see that there doesn't appear to be any imbalances based on their posture. So the next thing we're going to look at is our athlete's external rotation, how they can retract that scapula. So as you can see here, from external rotation of the shoulder, our athlete is struggling to keep that 90-degree elbow flexion. As you can see, one side is at a greater angle than the other side, and this is the same side that was dropping when we were looking at that scapular retraction. You can see our athlete struggling to externally rotate to get their hands on the wall, but this doesn't appear to be a flexibility issue from the pectoralis major or the latissimus dorsi, as we'll see later on. So to get them on the wall, our athlete actually needs to bring their back off the wall and it starts to round. So we can begin to see that this is a problem down to skill and our athlete is unfamiliar with the movement. Here I've put the athlete into a position of trying to retract the scapula without straightening their arms and whether they can do it or not. And we can see there's already a slight hyperextension of the lumbar spine. And we're soon going to see that the athlete cannot properly retract back and down. They're very trapezius dominant, and that seems to be the force coming through the shoulder girdle. We can see then that the athlete has a good range of motion through the latissimus dorsi as well. So tightness doesn't appear to be an issue affecting the range of motion. So from these derivatives and the shoulder girdle movements, we would appear that this is a trapezius dominant athlete. It would appear that there are no capacity issues, and our athlete is struggling to balance their scapular retraction through unfamiliarity and a dominant trapezius, and thus needs to address this skill issue to benefit further. To address this then, we need our athlete to practice proper scapular retraction and keeping it controlled on both sides and keeping them level throughout so they can improve this. Thank you for listening to my vlog 1. Here are the references that I've utilised.